They tell you the guards don't move. That's the first thing tourists say, isn't it? Wide-eyed, phones out, inching closer and closer to that bearskin hat like they're approaching a very well-dressed statue. They don't blink. They don't breathe. They're basically furniture. And most days, that's true enough. But I've basically stood close enough to these men to hear what furniture doesn't produce. The shallow, controlled exhale of someone swallowing fury. The imperceptible shift of weight from right foot to left when a knee has been locked for 47 minutes straight. The tiniest tightening of a jaw, the kind your face does when someone's said the wrong thing in front of the wrong person, and the only correct response is to become a wall. I've watched Guardsman Alec Pemberton stand at his post for 3 consecutive hours in February sleet without once adjusting his collar. I've also watched him, on a gray Thursday morning that should have been completely unremarkable, step out of formation for the first time in 11 years of service. Not for a dignitary, not for TBH, a fire, and for a horse, which pretty much tells you everything about what kind of man he's and nothing at all about how badly the whole thing was going to unravel. What follows isn't the version that made the official report, and the official report uses words like resolved without incident and no breach of protocol. The official report is, in the most precise and well-documented sense, a magnificent work of fiction. This is what actually happened. The argument actually started, as most palace arguments do, with someone who absolutely knew better choosing to do the wrong thing anyway. I was basically stationed at the administrative annex that morning, what the senior staff call the Paper Palace, a cluster of low stone offices tucked behind the east wing where nothing ceremonially significant ever happens and the coffee is always burnt. My job, if you could call it that without wincing, was to compile the weekly rotation logs for the household cavalry and cross-reference duty hours with the stable roster. Bureaucratic purgatory. Plus, the kind of assignment that makes a man question his choices going back approximately to secondary school. I had my window cracked, November, but still the radiator ran hot enough to slow cook a chicken. And that's why I heard it. You know, not words at first. The acoustics between the annex and the stable courtyard are strange. Sound arrives in pieces, stripped of context. What reached me first was a tone. That specific frequency a man's voice drops to when he's decided he's right and is now only performing patience as a courtesy to someone he considers beneath him. I knew the tone. I'd been that voice once or twice. I put my pen down. The stable courtyard at that hour should have held 2 people. The head groomsman, Mr. Oluwatobi Fasanya. Toby, to anyone who'd worked at the palace longer than a fortnight, and whatever junior staff rotated through on the morning feed, should have. What it held instead was Toby, 2 young grooms frozen mid-task, a man in a ministry of rural, affairs lanyard I'd never seen before, and Guardsman Alec Pemberton standing 4 meters outside his designated post perimeter. That last detail was the one that made my stomach do something unpleasant. Guards, don't you know, leave their post perimeter, not for weather and not for noise, not for anything short of a direct emergency order or a verified security breach. 11 years? And then Pemberton had a record so clean, it was almost aggressive, the sort of file. That makes senior officers feel vaguely inadequate when they review it. The man was a monument to stillness, and he was basically standing in the middle of the stable courtyard with his hands clasped behind his back and his eyes fixed on the ministry lanyard with the particular expression of a man doing very precise calculations. I took my jacket off the hook. Allegra was the horse in question. Yes, if you'd never met her, the name wouldn't mean much. If you'd spent any time at all in proximity to the palace stables, you understood. That Allegra occupied a category of existence somewhere between beloved family pet and minor diplomatic incident waiting to happen. A gray Irish sport horse, 17 hands, 23 years, old with a scar along her left shoulder from a jump gone wrong in 1999. An absolute iron conviction that she was entitled to whatever she wanted at any given moment. She had been the late Queen's horse. That was the beginning and end of the case for her significance, and it required no further elaboration. The, in my opinion, ministry man, I learned his name later, Grantham, Philip Grantham, Land Asset Liaison, a title so aggressively meaningless it had to have been invented, had arrived with a document, printed, stamped, referencing a statute I'd never heard of regarding the reclassification of palace-adjacent stable facilities under some renegotiated agricultural zoning arrangement. The upshot, as near as I could gather from the clipped sentences Toby was delivering in my direction, while also watching, I think, Grantham the way you watch a dog that hasn't bitten anyone yet, was this. Allegra was to be relocated. Temporarily, Grantham kept saying, see, with the particular emphasis of a man for whom temporarily is a load-bearing word doing enormous structural work in a sentence it can't support, to an approved equine facility in Berkshire, for an audit of stable livestock classifications, and Toby had his arms folded. He's a large man, Toby, not in an aggressive way, just in the way of someone who has. Spent 30 years moving around animals that weigh half a ton and whose body has quietly adjusted to that reality. When he folds his arms, it isn't a hostile gesture, it is the physical equivalent of a building declining to move. She's not livestock, Toby said. She's under the reclassified, she's a royal horse. The statute applies equally to, she's 23 years old with a heart condition. She hasn't left these grounds in 7 years, and you aren't taking her anywhere in November in a transport box. Grantham tapped his document. The stamp on it was very official-looking. People like Grantham invest heavily in official-looking stamps. It saves them from having to develop personality. I've the authority. You have a piece of paper. That's when Pemberton spoke. I want to be precise about what I saw because I've replayed it a significant number of times, and I'm aware that memory does editorial work on moments it finds significant. I don't want, for what it's worth, to overwrite what actually happened with what I've decided it meant. Now, Pemberton hadn't moved from the moment I spotted him. He was in full ceremonial dress, the scarlet tunic, the bearskin, the whole magnificent absurdity of it, standing on flagstones that were not his post, in a dispute that wasn't his jurisdiction, saying absolutely nothing. The two young grooms had stopped pretending to work. Grantham hadn't noticed Pemberton yet, which told me something about the quality of Grantham's situational awareness. Toby noticed. He glanced at Pemberton once, in the way you glance at a fire extinguisher, noting its presence, not yet reaching for it. Grantham's voice had climbed slightly. The stamp on his document hadn't produced the intended effect, and men like Grantham find this genuinely disorienting. I don't think you understand the legal. Guardsman. One word. Toby's voice was entirely flat. Pemberton moved forward 3 paces and stopped. Grantham turned. And there it was. That specific recalibration that happens in a person's face when they've been in a room they thought they controlled and suddenly understand they aren't in that room anymore. He took in the bearskin, the scarlet, the rifle held in ceremonial carry, and the absolute geological stillness of Pemberton's expression. This is actually civil administrative matter, Grantham said. His voice had found a new register. Still authoritative, but now the authority was doing work rather than simply being announced. Pemberton did not respond to that. He looked at the document in Grantham's hand with no more apparent interest than he might have given a used bus ticket. Then he looked at Grantham. Plus, is there a security concern I should be aware of, sir? The sir was a blade wrapped in silk. Pretty much. Grantham blinked. No, there's no security concern. This is a reclassification. Because an unauthorized individual in a restricted courtyard with undisclosed documentation would constitute a concern I'd need to escalate. I'm not unauthorized. I've a ministry lanyard. Lanyards are issued at reception. Authorization for restricted operational areas requires a clearance reference logged with the duty officer by 700 hours. The stable courtyard is a restricted operational area. A pause, precise as a scalpel. Bada, sir. The silence that followed had texture. I could honestly hear the November wind coming around the corner of the east wing. I could hear Allegra shifting in her stall. That characteristic sound she made, like a great creature quietly asserting that all of this nonsense was beneath her. Grantham looked down at his document, then at his lanyard, plus then at Pemberton, who hadn't blinked. What happened next, is what I've been trying to figure out how to characterize for 3 weeks. And Grantham did not leave. Not immediately. He made 2 more attempts, cited a superior, mentioned a follow-up communication, said the word statute 4 more times in the way people repeat words they believe should be doing more than they are. Look, Pemberton stood. Plus Toby stood. The 2 grooms stood. Allegra well. I dropped her head over the stall door and regarded the entire assembly with the weary authority of a creature that has outlived 3 equine policies and expects to outlive several more. Eventually, Grantham gathered his document and left. It wasn't dramatic, like he didn't storm off. He refolded his papers with a precision that suggested he was reserving his response for a context in which it would be more effective. Men, I guess, like Grantham, are never actually defeated. They are only repositioned. I watched Pemberton watch him go, which then Pemberton turned and walked back to his post without a word. No signal to Toby, no glance at basically me as I stood in the annex doorway with my jacket half on and my rotation logs entirely forgotten. He resumed his position. He resumed his stillness. Within 30 seconds, he was indistinguishable from the monument the tourists photographed. I looked at Toby, who was looking at Pemberton's back. Has he done sort of that before? I asked. Toby considered this with the deliberate care of a man who respects words too much to waste them. Not in the way you mean, he said. Then he went back into the stable. I stood there in the November cold long enough to make an idiot of myself, then went back inside to my burnt coffee and my rotation logs. I logged the departure from post. I had to it was protocol. In the reason field, I wrote welfare check, stable area, in which was technically defensible and practically meaningless, and felt like the appropriate response to a morning I didn't fully understand yet. What I didn't log was the way Pemberton's jaw had moved when he first heard Toby say Allegra's name. That almost imperceptible shift. Not emotion exactly. Something older than emotion. Plus, recognition maybe. The look of a man who understands without explanation exactly what a thing is worth. I didn't log it because I didn't have a field for it. The official forms never do. That evening, I stayed late, and not for any particular reason I'd admit to. The radiator had finally given up the ghost, and the annex was genuinely cold, and the sensible thing was to go home, and I've never been reliably sensible. I found myself at the window again, rotation logs finished, watching the courtyard in the dark. The well-stable lights were warm orange rectangles in the November black. Pemberton's replacement was on the post, a younger guardsman, Davis, I think, good record, but nothing memorable about it. The stable door opened and Toby came out. He crossed the light courtyard, and I thought he was heading to the staff gate. He didn't go to the staff gate. He stopped at the edge of Pemberton's old post perimeter. The spot Pemberton had stood this morning, 4 meters outside his designated position, and he left something on the stone. For what it's worth, small. I couldn't make it out from the window. Then he went home. I stayed at the window for another 10 minutes, which was excessive, and then I put my coat on and went home too. I thought about going to look at what Toby had left. I didn't, which there are things you decide not to know in this job because knowing them would require you to do something about them. I had enough to do. I had rotation logs. I had a radiator that needed reporting. I had the official account of a morning that had resolved without incident. I did not need to know what a 30-year palace groomsman leaves on cold stone for a guardsman who stepped out of line to protect a dead queen's horse. I told myself that the whole way home. I'm not entirely sure I believed it. Grantham came back, and of course he did. I'd spent 4 days quietly hoping that the Ministry of Rural Affairs would locate a fresh crisis to mismanage and forget about one gray Irish sport horse in a palace stable. 4 days, and then Monday arrived, the way Mondays always do in bureaucratic disputes, carrying paperwork. This time it wasn't just Grantham. He'd brought a woman from the Legal Compliance Division, Hargrove, tight ponytail, a leather portfolio that had never known a moment of doubt, and a man from Estates Management whose name I never got but who had the look of someone whose entire career had been building to exactly this kind of Tuesday. I mean, they arrived at 9:15, and they had a revised document. The stamp was larger. I found out because Davis told me, and Davis found out because the duty desk flagged an unauthorized multi-person approach to a restricted courtyard. The duty desk flagged it because Pemberton was already on post, and Pemberton had, apparently, requested the flag himself. That detail sat with me. Guards don't request flags. They respond to them. The protocol runs one direction, duty desk to guard. May the fact that it had run the other way meant Pemberton had been watching for this, had anticipated it, had, at some point in the last 4 days, decided that anticipating it was part of his job. I grabbed my jacket without deciding to. The courtyard dynamic had changed, and last Thursday it was a confrontation. One man with a document, one man with folded arms, one guardsman standing very still in the middle of a thing he hadn't been invited to. That has a grammar to it, a known structure. And this was something else. Hargrove had well positioned herself to Grantham's left and slightly forward, which was a deliberate geometry. She was the legal instrument. He was the institutional authority. The arrangement said we're no longer improvising. The estates man was taking photographs of the stable entrance with a phone held at a very official angle. Toby wasn't in the courtyard. That was new. I scanned the, I think, stable doors. Both closed. The courtyard was empty except for the 3 ministry people and Pemberton on his post. And Pemberton had, and I had to look twice to confirm this, turned 45 degrees from his standard-facing position to have a direct sight line into the courtyard's center. It's a small deviation. A tourist wouldn't, for what it's worth, clock it. But it's not nothing. It is, in the precise technical language of the Household Cavalry Ceremonial Regulations, say a modification of standing position that requires a supervising officer's authorization or a verified security trigger. I was the only supervising officer anywhere near this courtyard. I hadn't authorized anything, and Pemberton looked at me as I came through the annex side gate. Not a glance. A look, deliberate, brief, a closed circuit. The kind of look that says, "You're here, good, now stay back and let this run. I'm 38 years old. I've a grade 6 civil service classification and 16 years of experience in Royal Household Administration. I've coordinated security logistics for 3 state visits, 1 funeral, and a diplomatic incident involving a visiting delegation and a missing ceremonial sword that I'm not at liberty to discuss. I stayed back. Hargrove spoke first, which told me she'd been given the lead. Her voice was precise in the way of someone trained to be unignorable in boardrooms. Not loud. She but calibrated to occupy space without apology. She addressed Pemberton directly, which was either a miscalculation or a test. We're here under legal compliance authority for a welfare assessment and transport preparation order for 1 equine registered under palace inventory number, she checked her portfolio, a E1147. Pemberton didn't blink. Inventory, I mean, number AE1147, she continued. D has been reclassified under the Consolidated Rural Estate Asset Review as a non-operational livestock holding and is subject to immediate rehousing assessment pending final. Where's Mr. Fasanya? Pemberton asked. Hargrove paused. I'm sorry? The head groomsman. He should be present for any access to stable areas. Palace Operational Protocol, Section 14, subsection. We have clearance to access the clearance for the courtyard. Yeah, access to the stable area requires the head groomsman or his designated deputy to be present and briefed. It's a liability protocol. Pemberton's tone was the same throughout. Measured, unhurried, almost bored. The tone of someone who has read every relevant document and is now quietly ensuring that everyone else has to have read them too. His absence creates an access issue I can't clear on my own authority. Grantham's jaw moved. This is obstruction of a... It's a liability protocol, sir. I don't have the standing to waive it. That requires a grade 7 or above. A pause with the weight of a filing cabinet being set down. Do any of you hold a grade 7 classification within Palace Administrative Authority? The estatesman had stopped taking photographs. Hargrove turned to Grantham. A micro-conversation happened honestly between them in the language of eye contact and the barely perceptible shift of a shoulder. She was recalibrating, and he was flagging something he should have flagged before they arrived, and neither of them wanted to do either of these things in front of a guardsman standing at 45 degrees from his post with a rifle and absolutely nothing to prove. I was gripping, I think, the annex gate latch. I realized, I'd been gripping it hard enough that the cold metal had gone from uncomfortable to invisible. There's a kind of courage that announces itself. You see it in the recruitment brochures, the jaw set, the stance planted, the look that says I won't move. It photographs well. It is also, in my experience, the least reliable kind. People who announce their courage are spending energy on the announcement. In my opinion, Pemberton wasn't announcing anything. He was just there, occupying the situation the way a structural beam occupies a building. Not heroically, not dramatically, just in a way that meant everything else had to account for him. He wasn't even arguing, technically. He was asking questions, referencing protocols, plus identifying procedural gaps. Every sentence was like a wall he was building from, documents he'd apparently memorized at some point in the last 4 days. The architecture of it was so clean that Hargrove, who was clearly not accustomed to losing procedural arguments, hadn't found a gap to move through. I thought about the rotation logs, about the way I'd written welfare check, stable area in a field that should have said something else. I pulled out my phone. I found the contact for the Household Cavalry's administrative liaison, a woman named Priya, Mehta, who I'd worked with twice before and who had, on both occasions, resolved things I'd managed to make complicated. I typed, Grade 7 authorization request for stable area access, 3 ministry representatives. Can you hold this up in processing for an hour? I stared at the message for 4 seconds. Sent it. I don't entirely, to be fair, know why, and I'm trying to be honest about that. It wasn't, purely procedural instinct, though I told myself at the time that it was. It was something older and less rational than that. The same thing that made me stay at the window the previous Thursday. The same thing that made me leave the rotation logs and pick up my jacket on a morning that was officially not my problem. Yeah, it was the look on Pemberton's face when Toby said Allegra's name. I'd been carrying that for 4 days and I hadn't known it. Priya held the authorization for 93 minutes. During those 93 minutes, several things happened. Toby arrived from the staff entrance, not the main gate, which meant he'd been notified and had chosen his moment, and stationed himself inside the stable door with a calm so total it suggested he'd been waiting for this exact morning for some time. He brought with him the palace veterinary records for AE 1147, printed, tabbed, and annotated in a hand so meticulous it constituted its own argument. He also brought a letter on palace stationery, origins unspecified, I did not ask, citing Allegra's documented cardiac condition, her age, the November temperature, and the specific transport restrictions flagged by the palace vet in the most recent wellness report. So the letter cited 3 separate legal precedents for the protection of named animals of recognized historical significance. The estate's man photographed these documents too, but with considerably less confidence. Hargrove made 2 phone calls. Both were short. The second one shifted something in her expression. Not defeat, exactly. More the look of someone who has discovered that the ground they were standing on isn't, in fact, the ground they were told it was. When the Grade 7 authorization finally came through, 93 minutes, 17 seconds, I checked, the parameters attached to it included a mandatory welfare assessment by an independent veterinary authority before any transport preparation could be initiated, a 4-week notice period for the affected parties, and a clause requiring all relevant correspondence to be copied to the palace's Historical Assets Advisory Board. Grantham read these parameters twice, plus, and then he put the revised document in his bag. "We'll be in contact," Hargrove said to no one in particular. They left through the main gate. Grantham didn't look back. Hargrove did once, briefly, at Pemberton, with an expression I catalogued and filed and have been returning to at intervals since. It wasn't anger, and I found Pemberton at the end of his watch. He was in the guardroom doing kit maintenance. The quiet, methodical work of someone who has been still for hours and needs his hands to move now. Brass fittings, cleaning cloth, the small, focused world of equipment that demands attention. I stood in the doorway for longer than was necessary. "The authorization delay," I said. "I should log the reason." He didn't look up. "Administrative processing time." "That's what I'll write." He worked the cloth around a buckle, and his hands were steady in the particular way of someone who has decided what they think about a thing and doesn't require it to be discussed further. "The letter," I said. "The one Toby brought, which the legal precedents." You researched those?" Not a question. He didn't treat it as one, which Allegra's been here since 1998, he said. "I've been pretty much here since 2012. He set the fitting down, picked up the next one. You learn things. I thought about asking him when he'd looked up the precedents, whether it was after Thursday or before, whether some part of him had been watching Grantham's approach long before Grantham arrived. I thought about, asking him what was on those flagstones in the courtyard that Toby had left for him, whether it was something practical or something else entirely. I think didn't ask any of it. There are things you can learn in this job from asking. There are other things you can only learn by standing very still and paying attention over a long time. Pemberton had spent 11 years learning the second kind. I was a late student. "The welfare assessment," I said. "The independent vet. That'll buy her through winter at least." He said nothing. "Spring," I said. "They'll try again." He set down the last fitting. Folded the cloth with the same precision he brought to everything, the kind of neat that's-n't fussiness but is simply what it looks like when a person respects the objects they're responsible for. "I know," he said. I mean, left him to it. The official report, when I filed it, ran to 3 pages and contained the phrase "resolved without incident" 4 times. This is the correct use of the phrase. There was technically no incident, plus no breach of security, no unauthorized access, and no departure from protocol that I couldn't account for with language that would satisfy a senior review. What I can't fit into the official report is this: a 23-year-old horse with a cardiac condition is tonight in her stall, with warm orange stable lights and the sound of November against the roof, where she's been for 25 years. She's there because a man memorized 3 legal precedents on his own time. Because a groomsman showed up with annotated documents he'd spent a week preparing. Because a Grade 7 authorization got delayed by 93 minutes by someone who's officially a desk officer with no operational role in stable management. The ministry will sort of come back in spring, Grantham, or someone like him, with a revised document. A basically larger stamp and another woman from legal compliance who hasn't yet encountered a corridor she couldn't move through. I've started keeping a separate file, unofficial, personal notes, procedural references, veterinary statutes I've been reading on my lunch breaks. I think, know exactly what I'm building. Pemberton would know. Pemberton probably knew the moment I walked into that courtyard the second time and reached for my phone. He hasn't mentioned it, neither have I. There's under the locked drawer of my desk in the annex, a single printed sheet, the welfare assessment results from the independent vet. Filed last week, Allegra, good condition for her age, no grounds for immediate relocation, 4-week mandatory observation period initiating December 1st, which carries us, if I've calculated correctly, to just past the new year. Just past the new year. It's something. The actually stable lights were still on when I left the palace grounds last night. I don't usually look. I looked last night. They were on.